Every woman in Black Ridge Pass wanted him. Every man feared him. And every soul in that valley believed they knew exactly what kind of man Caleb Rourke was, until the winter came and he chose her. Not the banker's daughter, not the widow with the fine house on the hill. He chose the woman they laughed at. The one they called names behind her back and sometimes to her face. What happened next didn't just save the town. It broke it wide open. Nantich, bình luận thành phố bạn đang xem để tôi biết câu chuyện này đã đi được bao xa, và theo dõi để không bỏ lỡ phần tiếp theo. The wagon came in from the North Pass on a Thursday morning, which was ordinary enough. Wagons came through Black Ridge Pass all the time, traders, settlers, the occasional government surveyor with a leather satchel and a bad attitude. Nobody paid much attention to wagons anymore. But this wagon carried only one man, and that man carried nothing except a canvas pack, a long rifle wrapped in oilcloth, and the kind of quiet that made people stop what they were doing. He pulled the mule to a stop in front of Hester's Feed and Dry Goods, climbed down without hurrying, and tied the animal to the post the way someone ties a knot they expect to last, deliberately, without waste. He was broad through the shoulders in the way that came from actual labour, rather than boasting about it, with dark hair gone a little long and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in some weeks. His coat was elk hide, worn soft at the elbows, and his boots were the kind that had seen real country. He walked into Hester's without looking at anyone on the street. Inside, old Ned Hester was stacking flour sacks behind the counter and nearly dropped one when the man ducked through the low doorway. Ned was 63 years old and had run the store for 30 of those years, and he prided himself on knowing every face that came through Black Ridge. He did not know this one at first. Then he looked closer. At the scar along the left jaw, at the particular way the man stood, weight shifted slightly to his right leg from an old injury, and his mouth went dry. "Caleb Rourke," Ned said. It wasn't a question. The man looked at him with pale grey eyes that gave nothing away. "Ned?" "Lord Almighty!" Ned set the flour sack down on the wrong shelf without noticing. "It's been, 6 years? 7? 7. Ned shook his head slowly. "You look—" He searched for the right word. "The same." Caleb Rourke didn't respond to that. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket and slid it across the counter. A list. Caleb's handwriting was blunt and functional. Cornmeal, salt pork, dried beans, gun oil, a new whetstone, 2 spools of heavy thread. "Give me a day," Ned said, scanning the list. "Most of this I got, but the gun oil I'll need to— I'll be back tomorrow morning." Are you staying somewhere? I can tell Ruth to put a room together at the— "I've got a camp," Caleb said. He took the list back, folded it, returned it to his pocket. Tomorrow morning. He left the same way he came in. No pleasantries, no questions about the town, who'd died, who'd married, what had changed. Ned stood behind his counter and listened to the boot steps cross the porch and descend to the street, and then he did something he hadn't done in years. He walked to his front window and watched. Caleb Rourke untied his mule, turned it around, and headed back up the north road without once looking back at the town that had just recognized him. By supper time, everyone in Black Ridge Pass knew he was back. The town wasn't large, maybe 400 people if you counted the farms on the valley's outer edges, and it had the particular quality of small places where news moved faster than horses. By the time the Delman family sat down to eat, their 16-year-old daughter Clara had already heard the story from 2 different girls her age, each of whom had embellished different details. By the time Sheriff Walt Pruitt finished his evening rounds, 3 separate men had stopped him to ask if he'd heard. He had. His deputy had told him within an hour of the wagon stopping on the main street. "Caleb Rourke," Walt repeated, mostly to himself, leaning back in his chair at the jailhouse. He laced his fingers behind his head and stared at the ceiling. "Of all the—" His deputy, a young man named Foster, who was 24 and eager in the way that young deputies are before something bad happens to them, said, "Who is he exactly? I've heard the name, but I was only a kid when—" "He grew up here," Walt said. "Left when he was— Hell, he must have been 21. Just went up into the mountains one fall and didn't come back." He paused. "The next spring we found his father's place cleaned out. Not abandoned, cleaned out. Like he'd packed everything worth taking and left everything that wasn't. We figured he'd gone north, maybe to the territories. But he was in the mountains. Apparently." Walt picked up his coffee mug and found it empty. "I've heard things over the years. Trappers mostly. Said there was a man up in the high country, past the Sentinel Range, who knew those mountains better than any guide they'd ever hired. Said he'd show up sometimes, trade pelts, buy supplies from a post 2 days north of here, then disappear again." He set the mug down. "I always figured it was him." Foster chewed on that for a moment. Why'd he come back? Walt looked at the ceiling a while longer. That, he said, is a very good question. The first woman to make an active effort was Dorothea Crane, which surprised no one who knew Dorothea. She was 26, the youngest daughter of Harold Crane, who owned the sawmill and half the timber contracts in the valley, and she was, by the frank assessment of the town, the most conventionally beautiful woman in Blackridge. She had dark auburn hair and green eyes, and she knew exactly what both of those things were worth in a place like this valley. She was not stupid. She simply had learned early that her particular currency opened most doors, and she had built her whole understanding of the world around that knowledge. She was at Hester's the next morning when Caleb came back for his supplies. She had dressed carefully. Not obviously carefully. That would have been a mistake, and Dorothea didn't make obvious mistakes. She wore a blue wool dress that was nice without being formal, her hair loosely pinned rather than elaborately arranged. She arrived at the store with a list of her own, and she made sure to arrive 30 minutes before she would normally have gone, based on what she'd heard about when the mountain man had said he'd return. He came in at 9:30. He looked at Ned behind the counter, then at the crates Ned had already pulled together, and then at Dorothea, who was examining a bolt of calico fabric with the focused attention of a woman with no interest at all in the man who had just entered. "Your order," Ned said, gesturing at the crates. Caleb walked to the counter and began checking items against his list. He pulled a leather pouch from his coat and counted coins out on the counter without being asked. He already knew what things cost, apparently, or he'd calculated it, and Ned checked the amount and nodded. Dorothea set down the calico. "Excuse me," she said pleasantly, directing her voice toward Caleb. "I don't mean to intrude, but aren't you Caleb Rourke? Ned mentioned you'd be coming by. I'm Dorothea Crane. My father owns the mill." Caleb looked at her. It was the kind of look that was hard to read, because it wasn't hostile and it wasn't interested. It was simply observational, the way you might look at a tree you were trying to determine the age of. "Harold Crane's daughter," he said. "That's right." She smiled. She had a good smile and she knew it. "Welcome back to Blackridge. It's been quite a few years, I imagine." 7. "Well, the town has grown a good deal since then. We have a new church, and the Delmans put in a proper hotel last spring. Are you? Will you be staying long?" He was already lifting the first crate. "No," Dorothea blinked. She wasn't accustomed to the word no, arriving that quickly, without softening, without the speaker looking at least a little sorry about it. "Oh, well, it's a shame. People would love the chance to catch up with you. My father always spoke well of your family." Caleb looked at her again, that same flat, assessing look. "Your father tried to buy our land 3 times while my father was still alive," he said, "and twice after he died." Ned behind the counter very deliberately became occupied with something beneath the countertop. Dorothea's smile held, but it was working harder now. "Well, I'm sure there was just business involved in—" "Likely." Caleb picked up the second crate. "Good morning, Miss Crane." He left. Ned resurfaced from behind his counter and said nothing, which was the wisest decision he had made all week. Stakak. The story of the exchange at Hester's spread through Blackridge with the speed of something people genuinely enjoyed telling. There were embellishments, there always were, but the essential shape of it held. The mountain man had looked right at Dorothea Crane, the most sought-after woman in the valley, and walked out without a second glance. This, predictably, made him vastly more interesting to everyone. There is something in human nature, not flattering, but real, that transforms indifference into mystery. Caleb Rourke had shown no particular warmth, no particular cruelty. He had simply not cared, and in a town full of people who spent enormous energy caring what others thought, that not caring was like a lit match dropped near dry grass. The unmarried women of Blackridge Pass held their opinions carefully, the way you hold something hot. Most of them had watched Dorothea's attempt from a safe distance, some from the window of the seamstress shop across the street, others through the relay of gossip that moved from one end of Main Street to the other before noon. The general interpretation was, he's not easily won. That means he's worth winning. This was, as logic, more or less backwards, but it was the logic of the valley, and the valley ran on it. Caroline Pruitt, the sheriff's wife, said to her neighbour Agnes Mull over a back fence that afternoon, "He sounds like trouble." Agnes Mull, who was 47 and had been widowed twice and had opinions about most things, said, "He sounds like a man who spent 7 years not being bothered by anybody. The fact that the Crane girl couldn't get 2 minutes of attention out of him doesn't make him a catch. It makes him odd."
Same thing in this town, Caroline said. Agnes considered that and couldn't argue with it. Caleb's camp was 3 miles up the north road, set back into a fold of tree-covered hillside where a small creek ran. He'd found the spot on his first afternoon back. Instinct more than memory, the same way he found everything in terrain he'd once known. You read the land, not a map. The creek said fresh water. The tree cover said shelter from wind. The south-facing slope said he'd get morning sun on his tent while the frost burned off the ground. He'd made a small fire that first night and sat beside it with his coffee and the kind of company he'd grown used to over 7 years. None at all. He was back in Blackridge because he needed a specific set of supplies he couldn't get from the northern post, and because his winter camp in the high country had taken damage in a late-season rockslide that had cost him most of his preserved food stores and one of his 2 sleeping blankets. That was the entirety of the reason. He would resupply, do a few small repairs on his equipment, and go back up before the first serious cold came down from the peaks. He estimated he needed 10 days, maybe 12. He had not expected the attention, though he should have. He knew how small towns worked. He had grown up in one. The morning after the business at Hester's, he went to see the leatherworker about getting a pack strap replaced. The leatherworker was a man named Joseph Alt, somewhere in his 50s, missing 2 fingers on his left hand from an old accident, and he did decent work and asked only the questions relevant to the job. Caleb appreciated this, but when he left Alt's shop, 3 women were walking on the opposite side of the street in a cluster, and the moment he appeared in the doorway, they all stopped talking and looked at him. He looked back at them. They didn't look away, which was unusual. Most people looked away. He walked to his mule, untied it, and rode up the north road. Behind him, the 3 women began talking again, faster than before. Walt Pruitt caught up with him on the 4th day. Caleb was at the livery, checking his mule's shoes, when the sheriff appeared in the wide doorway with his hat in his hands. Walt was in his late 40s, a big man running to softness in the middle, with the kind of face that had been weathered by years of having to look calm when he wasn't. "Caleb," he said. "Sheriff." Walt came in, let his eyes adjust to the shade. "You look well. You didn't walk over here to tell me that?" Walt exhaled through his nose, almost a laugh. "No, I didn't." He turned his hat brim through his fingers. "I wanted to get ahead of something before it becomes a thing I have to manage. There are people in town who have concerns about you being back." Caleb looked up from the mule's hoof. "What kind of concerns?" "The Cranes mostly. Harold Crane he's Harold Crane. He heard what you said to his daughter and he's taking it as some kind of—" Walt waved a hand. "He's a man who doesn't like being reminded of things he'd rather forget. And he's got enough influence in this town that when he's unhappy, he makes sure other people know about it." Caleb set the hoof down and straightened. "I said the truth. His daughter asked me a question and I answered it." "I know. I'm not saying you were wrong." Walt paused. "I'm saying there's the kind of right that makes your life simple and the kind of right that makes your life complicated. I suspect you know the difference." "I do." Caleb picked up the brush and began working it along the mule's flank. "I don't particularly care which kind it is." Walt watched him work for a moment. "You planning to stay long?" 10 days, maybe 12. "And then?" "Back up." Walt nodded slowly. "You ever think about— you've got skills a lot of men in this valley don't. You know those mountains better than anyone. There's work here. Good work. Guiding, scouting, helping the timber crews navigate the upper country. Crane would even hire you, sore as he is because he's a businessman before he's anything else." Caleb kept brushing. "I don't want to work for Harold Crane. I didn't mean— I don't want to work for anybody, Walt. That's the whole of it." Walt put his hat back on. He stood there another moment, the way people do when they have more to say but can't find the shape of it. Then he said, "The town's changed some. Some for the better. Some—" He trailed off. "There's an outsider woman been here about 3 months. Mara Ellison. She came through on a supply wagon and ended up staying. I'm not sure what her story is entirely. The town hasn't been especially kind to her." Caleb stopped brushing. He looked at Walt. "Why are you telling me that?" Walt seemed slightly surprised that he'd said it at all. "I don't know," he admitted. "Something made me." He tipped his hat. "Stay out of trouble, Caleb." "I wasn't in any trouble," Caleb said. "I was fixing my mule." Walt smiled at that. A genuine one, small and tired, and left. Caleb saw Mara Ellison for the first time on his 6th day in Blackridge, and he almost didn't register it as a significant moment, which was probably appropriate. Significant moments almost never announce themselves. He was coming out of the hardware store with a coil of new rope over one shoulder when she came around the corner from the alley between the hardware store and the milliner's shop. She was carrying 2 heavy buckets, water from the weight of how she moved, and she had them both in hand rather than using a yoke, which meant her arms were taking the full strain on each side. She was a large woman, not tall particularly, maybe 5'4", but broad-shouldered and heavy through the middle in the way that some people are built, and that has nothing to do with anything except the body they were born into. She had dark brown hair pinned back practically, a plain wool dress in a faded green, and she was walking with her head slightly down the way people walk when they have learned that making eye contact in a particular place leads to particular problems. She nearly ran into him, coming around the corner. She pulled up short, water sloshing over the lip of one bucket onto her boot, and for just a second, her face showed the particular expression of someone who is braced for something unpleasant. "Sorry," she said. Her voice was lower than he'd expected, steady. She started to move around him. "Here," Caleb said. She stopped. He reached out and took one of the buckets from her right hand before she had a chance to think about whether she wanted him to. He looked at it, then up the alley. "Where are these going?" She stared at him for a moment. Not the way women in this town stared at him, not with that particular calculation, but with simple puzzlement, like she was trying to figure out what was happening. "The boarding house," she said carefully. "Around the back, Mrs. Kettler's. I know it." He walked. After a second, she followed, still carrying the other bucket, matching his pace. They went up the alley and around the back of the boarding house in silence. He set the bucket down next to the door she indicated. She set hers next to it. "Thank you," she said. She was still watching him with that careful look, like she hadn't settled yet on what kind of thing this was. "Water's heavy," he said, which was not a profound observation, but it was an honest one. She glanced down at the buckets. "Yes, it is." Then, like she'd decided to risk something, "You're Caleb Rourke. You know who I am. Everybody knows who you are. You're the only thing anyone's talked about all week." She said it without inflection, not bitterly, not warmly, just a fact. He looked at her directly. "You're Mara Ellison." Something shifted in her expression, not fear exactly, but a kind of readiness. "Walt Pruitt told you about me. He mentioned you. What did he say?" "That you've been here 3 months, that the town hasn't been kind to you." She was quiet for a moment. The back of the boarding house was quiet too, just the sound of wind moving through the dry grass of the yard and somewhere a door banging on a loose hinge. "That's accurate enough," she said finally. He didn't say anything to that, because there was nothing to say to it that would change it. "Well," she said. She reached for one of the buckets. "Thank you for the help." "What are you doing out here?" he asked. He stopped, reconsidered. "What brought you to Blackridge?" She looked at him with those careful eyes. They were dark, almost black, and they were not unintelligent eyes. "I was studying the mountain weather systems," she said. "The valley sits at a particular elevation between 3 peak ranges. The way the fronts come in from the northwest, there's a pattern that doesn't match what the almanacs predict. I wanted to study it up close." She paused. "I know how that sounds." "It sounds like someone who knows what they're interested in." She blinked. "Most people think it sounds like a woman who's lost her mind. Most people haven't spent 7 years watching a mountain range." She studied him again, and this time the wariness in her face shifted slightly. Not gone. She hadn't decided to trust anything yet, and he respected that, but adjusted, like she was recalculating something. "I should bring these inside," she said. "Right." She picked up both buckets. Then she paused. "The northwest front," she said, looking back at him. "The one that comes through the Sentinel Gap. Have you seen it from up in the high country? The way it builds?" He had. He'd watched it from a ridge above the tree line, seen the wall of grey come up from behind the peaks with a speed that shouldn't have been possible, watched the temperature drop 8 degrees in 20 minutes. "Yes," he said. "Does it always come in the same way? From the same direction?" "No," he said. "Sometimes it splits around Anvil Peak. Sometimes it follows the canyon south before it turns east. Depends on what's happening further north." She was very still. "How often does it split?" "Maybe 1 in 4 times." She was quiet for a moment, clearly turning something over in her mind. "That's what I thought," she said, half to herself. Then back to him. "Thank you. For the bucket and the—" she gestured vaguely, "the information." She went inside. Caleb stood in the yard of the boarding house for a moment longer than he needed to, which was not something he did often. The town's campaign to attach Caleb Rourke to something, to someone, did not let up. It came in different shapes. Some of it was social pressure, the kind that operates through invitation. Caleb was asked to supper by 3 different families in the space of 2 days, each invitation delivered by a woman of marriageable age or the father of one. He declined all of them with the same brevity he applied to everything. Some of it was more direct. Dorothea Crane had not given up. She wasn't built for giving up. And she'd adjusted her approach. She stopped trying to engage him in conversation and instead made sure to be visible in the right place, which was a different kind of effort. Clara Delman, the 16-year-old, had confided to her friends that she intended to marry the mountain man when she was old enough, which her friends took seriously and her mother did not. And some of it came from the men. From Harold Crane specifically, who had shifted from irritation to something more like strategy. Harold Crane was not a stupid man. He was the kind of man who had built something real, the mill, the timber contracts, the network of obligations that ran through the valley like roots. And he had built it by knowing when to push and when to wait. He had decided that Caleb Rourke was a resource, the same way the timber stands on the eastern slopes were a resource. The question was, how to extract value from him. He sent his foreman to the livery where Caleb was spending time and offered a job. Caleb said no. Crane sent a written note the next day to Mrs. Kettler's boarding house, where Caleb had eventually taken a room to escape the camp's cold nights as the temperature dropped.
The note offered a significant sum to lead a survey expedition into the northern range before winter closed the high passes. Caleb did not reply. Walt Pruitt heard about the offers and found Caleb at the hardware store again. "You're making Harold Crane uncomfortable," Walt said. "Good," said Caleb. "You know he's not going to just stop." "I know." Caleb turned a drawer bolt over in his hand, checking the thread. "He's a man who thinks everything has a price. He'll keep trying to find mine." "Does it have one?" Caleb set the drawer bolt down and picked up a different one. "Not one he can afford." Dang.
On his 8th day in Blackridge, Caleb saw what the town was like when Mara Ellison walked through it. He was at the far end of Main Street outside the tack shop when she came around the corner from the direction of the boarding house. She was carrying a leather journal and a canvas bag, and she moved the way she always seemed to move, head not quite down but angled slightly, like she was watching the ground just ahead of her feet. 2 women were standing outside the dressmaker's shop. He knew them by sight, respectable women, middle-aged, the kind who organized church suppers and had opinions about propriety. When Mara came abreast of them, one of the women said something to the other, her voice low, but not so low that it wasn't meant to be heard. The other woman laughed. Mara didn't stop. Her pace didn't change. Her face didn't change. She walked past them and kept walking. Further up the street, outside the saloon, which she was clearly not going into, 2 young men who'd come in from one of the outlying farms leaned on the railing and watched her pass with the particular expression of young men who'd decided that cruelty was the same thing as humor. One of them said something. The other one laughed. Mara kept walking. She went into the land office, which was where she apparently was headed, and the door closed behind her. Caleb stood outside the tack shop and thought about several things, and none of which were comfortable. He had seen cruelty in the mountains, in weather, in animals, in the simple indifference of terrain that didn't care whether you lived or died. That kind was at least honest. What he'd just watched had the particular ugly quality of cruelty that dressed itself up as humor and called itself harmless. He went back to the tack shop and finished his business. But he kept thinking about it, about her pace that didn't change, about the way her face hadn't moved, about how much practice it took to build that kind of control, and what it cost to maintain it day after day in a town that couldn't get past what it saw when it looked at her. He'd been watching the sky from his windows at the boarding house. The weather was changing. The temperature had been dropping steadily for 3 days, and the clouds coming in from the northwest were the wrong color. A particular flat grey that he'd learned to read up in the high country, not the usual passing storm, something heavier. He thought about the conversation at the back of the boarding house, the northwest front, the way it splits around Anvil Peak, 1 in 4 times. He went to find her that evening. He knocked on the door of her room at the boarding house. He'd found out her room number from Mrs. Kettler, who'd given him a long look before providing it, and waited. She opened the door 3 inches and looked at him through the gap with those dark, careful eyes. "The sky," he said. "Have you been watching it?" A pause. Then she opened the door wider. Her room was small and covered in paper. Charts. She'd made charts of the weather patterns. Pinned to the plaster wall above the little writing desk, there were pages and pages of notations in a small, precise hand. She looked past him at the window at the end of the hall, where the sky was going dark in the way it goes dark before heavy weather. "For 4 days, she said. "I've been watching it." "And?" She looked back at him. "It's not going to split around Anvil Peak this time." He'd thought the same thing. "No," he agreed. "It's going to come straight through the Sentinel Gap," she said. "And when it does—" She stopped. "Say it." She said it plainly, without drama, the way she seemed to say most things. "It's going to be the worst storm this valley has seen in a generation, maybe longer." She paused. I've been trying to find someone who'll listen for 2 days. The land office laughed at me. Walt Pruitt said he'd keep an eye on the weather. Harold Crane's foreman told me to go home. She said all of this with the same level tone she used for everything, but there was something underneath it that wasn't quite anger. Nobody wants to hear what I have to say. Caleb looked at her charts, at the lines of notation, the careful measurements, the dates and temperatures and wind direction records she'd built over 3 months. Then he looked at the sky out the hall window. I believe you, he said. She was still for a moment. Something in her face moved, just a small thing, just a fraction of adjustment, but he caught it. What do we do? She said. It was the right question. Not will you fix it, or what do the men need to do? Just what do we do? He appreciated that more than he could have said. Start by telling me everything you know, he said. Every detail. She stepped back from the doorway. Come in then, she said. This might take a while. He went in. She closed the door. Outside the boarding house, the first thin fingers of cloud were sliding down from the northwest, past the dark bulk of the Sentinel Peaks, moving faster than clouds had any right to move, carrying with them everything that was coming. The town didn't know it yet. But in a small room covered in charts and careful handwriting, 2 people who had both spent their lives being dismissed by one kind of world or another sat down together and began to figure out what to do about it. The maps she'd made were not pretty. They weren't meant to be. Mara had pinned them to the wall in overlapping layers, the oldest ones underneath, the newest on top, and they told a story in pencil lines and temperature notations that most people in Blackridge wouldn't have been able to read even if they'd been willing to look. Which they hadn't been. Caleb stood in front of them for a long time without speaking, tracing the pattern of the northwest fronts with his eyes, and she let him. She'd learned early that people who were actually thinking didn't need to be talked at. This line here, he said finally, pointing at a series of marks along the upper edge of one chart. These are your temperature drops? Rate of drop, she said, over 20-minute intervals. Every time a front came through the Sentinel Gap, I recorded how fast the temperature fell and from which direction the wind shifted. She leaned past him to point at a cluster of notations near the bottom of the chart. These 3, October 2nd, October 19th, November 4th, those were the split storms. The ones that went around Anvil Peak. See how the rate of drop is slower? The wind shift comes from the southwest, not the northwest. He looked at the numbers. And this one. He pointed at the most recent entries, the ones from the past 4 days. Northwest wind shift. Temperature dropping fast. She stepped back. It's not splitting. He turned and looked at her directly. The way he'd looked at things in the mountains when he was deciding whether they were worth taking seriously. How much time do you think we have? 2 days? Maybe a little more. She folded her arms. Not defensively, he thought, just the way someone holds themselves when they're trying to stay steady. But the supply situation in this town, I've been listening, paying attention. The Kettler family is low on firewood. The Pruitts have enough, but not much extra. The boarding houses on the east side didn't finish their winterizing, and the main road north... She paused. If the storm comes through the gap the way I think it's going to, that road will be impassable within 12 hours of the snow starting. Impassable how long? The last storm of this type, I found records at the land office from 20 years ago, closed the north road for 11 days. 11 days. Caleb ran the calculation without needing to think hard about it. A town of 400 people, inadequately supplied, cut off from the main supply routes in the middle of a serious winter storm. It wasn't a death sentence if people handled it right. It was a serious problem that became a catastrophe if they panicked or waited too long to act. We need to talk to Walt Pruitt, he said. I already tried. You went alone. She looked at him steadily. Yes. Come with me this time. Something crossed her face, not reluctance exactly, more like a careful assessment of probability. You think it'll be different because you're there. He didn't try to soften it. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. He watched her work through it, the practical calculation against the thing that made the calculation necessary, which was the specific unfairness of needing a man standing next to you to be taken seriously. He could see that she knew exactly what it meant, and he could see that she'd decided it didn't matter as much as the 11 days. All right, she said, in the morning. Walt Pruitt's office was already busy when they arrived. 2 farmers from the valley's southern edge had come in to report a dispute over a fence line, and a boy had been caught throwing rocks at windows on the east side. The deputy Foster was handling the boy badly, Caleb thought, with too much talking and not enough firmness, and Walt was behind his desk with the farmers, his expression the particular exhausted patience of a man who has heard about this specific fence too many times. He looked up when Caleb came in. Then he looked at Mara, who'd stopped just inside the doorway. "Give me a few minutes," Walt said. They waited. The farmers left. Foster took the boy somewhere. Walt poured himself a cup of coffee, offered them the same. Mara accepted, Caleb didn't, and sat down behind his desk. "Miss Ellison," Walt said, not unkindly, "you look like you've got something on your mind." "The storm," Mara said. She'd brought one of her charts, the most recent one, rolled and tucked under her arm. She put it on his desk now, unrolled it and held it flat with her palms. "I've been tracking the northwest front since I arrived in August. This system that's building, it's not a normal early winter storm. It's coming straight through the Sentinel Gap and it's going to hit within 2 days, possibly less." Walt looked at the chart. He wasn't a stupid man, but he also wasn't a man who read weather charts, and what he was looking at was a dense web of notations that meant something to Mara and to Caleb, and very little to him. He looked at Caleb. "You agree with this?" "I've watched that gap for 7 years," Caleb said. "She's right about the pattern. The signs up in the high country, the way the wind's been sitting, the ice forming on the north-facing rocks, it matches what she's showing." Walt looked back at the chart. He picked up his coffee mug and held it without drinking from it. "What are you asking me to do?" "Get people to stock up now," Mara said. "Firewood, food stores, make sure the vulnerable households, the elderly, families with young children, have enough to last at least 2 weeks. Send word to the outlying farms to bring people in, or make sure they're prepared where they are. And the North Road, if the supply wagons that are expected this week can be moved up, ask to come immediately." "That's a significant undertaking," Walt said. "To ask the whole town to—" 11 days, Caleb said. "That's how long the North Road was closed in the storm of, 22 years ago. There are records at the land office. If this one's as bad as she thinks, it'll be the same or worse." Walt set his mug down. He rubbed the back of his neck. "If I go to the town council with this and the storm turns out to be nothing, I'm going to look like a fool who listened to—" He stopped. "Who listened to a woman no one takes seriously," Mara said. Flat, precise. You can say it. Walt at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. "I wasn't going to say that. But it's what you meant." He didn't answer that directly, which was itself an answer. "I'll talk to Harold Crane," he said finally. "He's got more resources than anyone in the valley. If he's willing to start moving supplies, Harold Crane will want something in return," Caleb said. Walt looked at him for a long moment. "Most likely." "Then talk to the other council members first. Crane last." "Caleb, I'm not telling you how to do your job. I'm telling you that if you go to Crane first, he'll slow walk it until he can figure out how to profit from it, and by the time he's done calculating, you'll have lost your window." He pushed back from where he was leaning on the wall. "Talk to the others first." Walt looked from him to Mara and back again. Then he stood, picked up the chart and looked at it again more carefully. "I'll need a copy of this, something I can show people." Mara pulled a second sheet from under her arm. She'd prepared a copy, cleaner than the original, with the key indicators labeled plainly. She put it on his desk. Walt looked at it. Then he looked at her, and for the first time since they'd come in, looked at her like he was seeing what was actually there rather than what he'd decided was there. "You did all this yourself?" "Yes." 3 months of— "Yes." He picked up the copy and nodded slowly. "I'll do what I can." It wasn't a promise exactly, but it was more than she'd gotten the day before, alone. The town did not receive the warning graciously. Walt called an informal meeting that evening at the community hall, the kind that didn't require a formal vote to convene, just a sheriff saying people ought to come talk about this. About 60 people showed up, which was more than enough to ensure the story would reach everyone else by morning. Mara stood at the back of the room. Caleb stood next to her, which caused its own disruption. There was a visible ripple of attention through the crowd when people registered who was standing where and with whom, but he didn't move. And after a moment, the room refocused on Walt, who was at the front trying to explain the situation. He explained it reasonably well. He had the chart, and he referenced it, and he talked about the historical records from 20 years ago. But inevitably, the room turned to questions, and inevitably, the questions turned pointed. Who drew up these charts? This from a man named Gerhard Ulm, who owned the feed store and had opinions about most things. Walt hesitated a fraction of a second. Miss Ellison, she's been tracking the weather patterns since August. The room's attention shifted. 50 people looked toward the back. Amara received it the same way she always received that kind of mass attention, with her face still and her eyes level, not shrinking, but not pretending it was comfortable either. "The woman from the boarding house," Ulm said. "Not quite a question. She has 3 months of documented weather data," Walt said. "And Caleb Rourke has confirmed that what she's describing matches what he's observed from up in the high country." This caused a different kind of disruption.
Caleb's name in the room had weight in a way that Mara's didn't, and he was aware of that, and he hated it, and he kept his face still about it. People started talking to each other in low voices. Harold Crane was there. Of course he was there. He was at everything that mattered in Blackridge, and he'd been quiet in the front row through all of this. He was a large man, Harold, with a grey beard trimmed precisely, and the kind of physical presence that came from decades of being the biggest person in most rooms. He stood now. "I think we're getting ahead of ourselves," he said pleasantly. "One woman's weather notations don't necessarily constitute cause for alarm. Weather is unpredictable. We've had early season cold snaps before. My timber crews are still working the upper slopes. If there were genuine cause for concern, we'd be seeing signs." "What signs are your crews seeing?" Caleb said from the back of the room. Harold turned. The pleasantness on his face stayed, but something behind it shifted. "I beg your pardon? Your timber crews. They've been on the upper slopes. What are they reporting about the weather?" A pause. Harold looked at his foreman, a stocky man named Dex Hamill, who was sitting 2 rows back. Hamill cleared his throat. "The cold's been coming in faster than usual," Hamill said, in the tone of a man who'd rather not be saying it. "The boys have been talking about getting off at the upper slopes for a couple days now." "That's consistent with what Miss Ellison's data shows," Caleb said. Harold Crane looked at Caleb Rourke for a long moment across the crowded room, and the two of them had a conversation in that look that had nothing to do with weather. Then Harold sat back down. The meeting didn't produce an organized plan.
Meetings in small towns rarely do. What it produced was anxiety, which spread through the assembled 60 people and would continue to move through the rest of the town over the next 12 hours. And anxiety in a small town is not entirely useless. It motivates people if it doesn't tip into panic first. Afterward, on the street outside, Dorothea Crane appeared at Caleb's elbow. He'd seen her in the room. She'd been sitting near her father, but she hadn't spoken during the meeting. "That was well handled," she said. She was looking at him with a different quality of attention now, like she'd recalibrated something. Getting Dex Hamill to say that in front of everyone. "I just asked a question. You knew what the answer would be." He looked at her. "Did you know? About the weather on the upper slopes?" She looked away for a moment. "I heard some of what the crews were saying. I mentioned it to my father. And? He said it was just the usual early cold." She paused. "He doesn't like being contradicted by data he didn't generate himself. She stopped. "It's a problem." Caleb nodded once. He started to move. "She's impressive," Dorothea said. He stopped. She was looking toward the hall doorway where Mara had just emerged and was heading back up the street in the direction of the boarding house. "I don't mean that. I mean it genuinely. I wouldn't have thought to do any of that. The charts, the records." She paused. "Most people here haven't thought much about what she is. They've just decided what she looks like," Caleb said. Dorothea had the grace to hold that. "Yes." She looked at him, and this time the calculation in her face was mostly gone, which made her look younger and considerably more honest.
"I'm sorry about the Hester's thing. What you said about my father and your land, that was fair." He hadn't expected that. He studied her face for a moment. "It was a long time ago," he said. "Some things don't get better with time," Dorothea said. "They just get buried." She pulled her shawl tighter against the cold. "Be careful with Harold. He's not going to forget that you embarrassed him in there." She went back inside. Caleb turned and walked up the street. The next morning, the temperature dropped 6 degrees before breakfast. Caleb could see his breath in the room when he woke up, which at this elevation in November wasn't remarkable, but the quality of the cold was different, heavier, the kind that sat on your chest rather than just hitting your face. He stood at the window of his boarding house room and looked at the sky, which had gone the color of old pewter overnight, the clouds low and fast-moving, racing each other through the gap between the sentinel peaks. He dressed and went downstairs. Mara was already in the small sitting room off the kitchen, her journal open, writing something with quick, focused strokes. She looked up when he came in. 6 degrees since midnight, she said. I felt it. Wind shifted at about 3 in the morning. I marked it. She turned the journal toward him so he could see the notations. It's accelerating faster than I estimated. We might have less than 2 days. He looked at the notes, then at the window. How much less? I don't know exactly. Maybe a day and a half. She closed the journal. I need to go up toward the North Pass this morning. There's a ridge about a mile out where I can get a clearer read on what's coming from the northwest. I'll go with you." She looked at him directly, and there was something in her expressions that was not quite the same as what had been there before, a slight lowering of the careful guard. Not gone. Just adjusted. "You don't need to—" "I know the trail to that ridge." He picked up his coat from the peg by the door. "And I need to see what's coming anyway." She thought about that for a moment. Then she closed her journal, put it in the canvas bag, and stood up. All right. They left the boarding house in the early grey light.
The town was barely stirring. A few lamps showed in windows, smoke starting to rise from chimneys, a dog barking somewhere in the east side. The street was empty except for Foster, the deputy, doing his morning round, who nodded at Caleb and gave Mara a somewhat startled look before moving on. The trail to the North Ridge was exactly where Caleb remembered it. A narrow track through second-growth pine that climbed steeply for the first quarter-mile before leveling out along a limestone shelf. He set a pace that was fast enough to be purposeful without being punishing, and she kept it without comment. She was, he noticed, a better walker than most people would have assumed, a steady, well-footed, with the careful attention to terrain of someone who had done a lot of it. They reached the ridge in 40 minutes. From there, the view opened up to the north and to northwest, and what Caleb saw confirmed every instinct he'd had since the evening before. The cloud wall coming down from the northwest was immense, not the ragged, varied weather of a normal early storm, but a solid mass, grey-white and organised, filling the sky from horizon to horizon. The sentinel peaks, which on a clear day were vivid and distinct, were already half swallowed by the leading edge of it. Mara was beside him, looking north with the same fixed attention. She had her journal out and was writing, recording the cloud height and coverage and the wind speed as she estimated it from the movement of the treetops below them. Her breath made small rapid clouds in the cold air. "There it is," she said, quiet. "Yes. People are going to say it's nothing until it hits. Some of them." He looked at the cloud wall a while longer. "Some of them will have started moving already. The ones who were listening last night."
"And the ones who weren't?" He thought about that honestly. They'll manage or they won't. That's always true. She wrote something else. "There's a supply cache," she said. "Old miner's cache from before the main road went through. It's mentioned in the land office records. I found a reference to it when I was going through the older files. Up in the eastern canyon, maybe 2 miles past where the trail forks near the old claim markers. According to the records, it was stocked as a way station in the bad winters for people who got cut off." She paused. "I don't know if it's still there. I don't know if anyone's used it in 20 years. Caleb turned to look at her. "You found this in the land office records?" "A deed annotation from 1847. The original claim owner mentioned it in a dispute about access routes." She met his eyes. "I've been reading through the older records for weeks, looking for anything about how people managed in the bad winters. Most of the clerks thought I was just—" She stopped. "Wasting time," he said. "Something like that." She looked back at the cloud wall. If that cache is still intact, it could mean a significant reserve of supplies for the town. And if there's a passable route through the eastern canyon, even in heavy snow, it might be an alternative when the North Road closes. Caleb looked northeast towards the canyon she was describing. He knew that country. Not as well as the high passes, but he'd been through it twice in his first years away from Blackridge before he'd gone further north. The terrain was rough, but not impossible. In heavy snow, it would be hard going, but hard was different from impassable. "Can you find the original deed?" he asked.
"The one with the annotation? I already copied down the relevant section." She pulled a folded piece of paper from her journal and held it out. He took it, read the cramped old handwriting. The location reference was imprecise but workable, the kind of description that assumed you knew the landscape. He folded it and put it in his coat pocket. She watched him do it. "You believe me," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "I told you I did." "Yes." She looked out at the grey wall coming down from the northwest. "I've spent 3 months in this town. I know what it means when people say they'll look into something, or they'll consider it, or they take the chart and thank you, and you never hear about it again." A pause. "You don't do any of that?" "No," he agreed. "Why not?" He thought about how to answer that, because what you're saying is supported by evidence, and because the storm doesn't care whether the town respects you. She was quiet for a long moment. Below them, the first thin veil of high cloud was starting to slide over the valley, the advance edge of what was coming. The temperature, already cold, dropped another degree. "We should get back," she said. "Yes." They started down the trail. She went first on the narrow section, ocean. He followed, and neither of them said anything else for a while, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who have looked at the same difficult thing together and have a shared understanding of what it means. Behind them, above the sentinel peaks, the sky was closing in.
They came back down the trail into a town that had already started to fracture along its usual lines. The thin veil of high cloud they'd watched sliding over the valley from the ridge had settled in while they were gone, turning the morning light flat and strange, the kind of light that made distances hard to judge and shadows disappear. People were out on the street more than usual for that hour, and they were talking in the tight clusters that meant anxiety had moved past curiosity and was starting to become something less manageable. Walt Pruitt was on the steps of the sheriff's office when Caleb and Mara came down Main Street. He watched them approach with an expression that said he had things to tell, and none of them were good. "Harold Crane called a separate meeting this morning," he said before they'd reached the steps. "At the mill. Town council plus the major property owners. I wasn't invited until it had already started." Caleb stopped. "What did they decide?" "Crane's position is that the storm warning is," Walt chose his words carefully, "premature. He's recommending the town continue normal operations and let his crews monitor the weather on the upper slopes. He'll send word if it looks serious." Mara was very still beside Caleb. "His crews," she said. "The same crews who've been telling his foreman to pull off the upper slopes for 2 days." "Yes." Walt rubbed the side of his face. "I brought that up. Crane said Hamill was exaggerating. Hamill was at the meeting, and he didn't argue." Caleb thought about Dex Hamill, a man who worked for Harold Crane and had a family to feed and a job he couldn't afford to lose. He didn't particularly blame Hamill for staying quiet. He blamed the situation that made a man choose between honesty and his livelihood, and he put that blame squarely where it belonged. "What about the other council members?" he asked. "2 of them are with Crane. Gerhard Ulm is sitting on the fence. The Delmans, Robert Delman, said he thought people ought to at least check their wood stores, which was the most he was willing to say out loud with Crane in the room." Walt looked at the sky. The flat grey was deepening now, the clouds lower and heavier than when Caleb and Mara had climbed the ridge an hour ago. "Crane's real objection isn't about the weather." "No," Caleb said, "it's about her." Walt glanced at Mara and then away. He said, not in those words, but he said it, that acting on the advice of an outsider with no standing in this community would set a bad precedent, that we don't know who she is or what her intentions are. Mara made a short, quiet sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "My intentions," she said. "I've been here 3 months recording weather data. I know. I'm trying to help these people." "I know that too." Walt spread his hands. "I'm telling you what he just said, not agreeing with it." The 3 of them stood there for a moment. Up the street, 2 women came out of the general store and stopped when they saw who was standing with the sheriff. One of them leaned close to the other and said something. Both of them looked at Mara and then at Caleb standing next to her, and their faces did complicated things. Caleb had been watching people look at Mara for days. The particular quality of dismissal this town had refined into something almost automatic, the way you stopped noticing a piece of furniture. He had told himself it was not his business, that he wasn't here to fix the moral failures of Blackridge Pass, that he had his supplies and his plans and his mountain to return to. He'd been telling himself that. He wasn't sure he believed it anymore. "What would it take," he said to Walt, "for you to act without the council?" Walt looked at him sharply. "That's a significant... I know what it is." "Answer the question." Walt thought about it honestly, which was something Caleb had always credited him for. "If I had something concrete, not just a weather chart, something physical, evidence that the situation was already critical." He paused. "If the North Road were already showing signs of closing, for example, or if we had confirmation that a supply route was compromised." Caleb reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the folded paper, the copy of the deed annotation, Mara's careful handwriting in the margin. He held it out to Walt. "There's an old way station cache in the Eastern Canyon. Miner's claim, 1847. According to Land Office records, it was stocked as an emergency reserve, and the route through that canyon was marked as an alternate road in bad winters." He let Walt take the paper. "If we find that cache intact, and if the eastern route is passable, that changes the town's options considerably. It also proves the situation is serious enough that someone needs to be making contingency plans." Walt read the paper slowly. "You want to go up there? Today, before the weather closes in? That's, Caleb, if the storm comes in while you're in the Eastern Canyon, then we'll deal with it." He glanced at Mara. "We." Walt looked at Mara, then back at Caleb, and the look on his face was the look of a man assembling a picture he hadn't expected to see. "You understand what you're doing," he said finally. It wasn't exactly a question. "Finding a supply cache," Caleb said.
Walt's expression said he meant something broader than that. He folded the paper and held onto it. I'll keep this. If you find anything up there, come to me first. Don't go to Crane. Don't talk to the council. Come to me. Agreed. Harold Crane found Caleb at the livery 30 minutes later. Caleb was loading the pack on his mule. Supplies for a day's expedition, rope, the oilcloth pack, his rifle, and Crane came into the livery with Dex Hamill behind him, which was how Crane generally moved through the world. The livery's owner, a quiet man named Tobias, found something to do at the very far end of the building. I heard you're planning a trip into the Eastern Canyon, Crane said. His voice was pleasant the way a contract clause is pleasant, friendly on the surface, specific underneath. Word moves fast, Caleb said, without stopping what he was doing. It's a small town. Crane clasped his hands behind his back. He had the posture of a man who had learned to make his size feel like authority. I wanted to talk to you before you went. Talk then. Crane looked at the pack on the mule, at the rope, at the extra wool blanket Caleb had tied on because the weather required it. You've been back 9 days, he said. In that time, you've managed to disrupt a town council meeting, undermine several of my business relationships, and publicly align yourself with a woman who has no standing in this community and no stake in what happens here. He paused. I'm curious what you think you're accomplishing. Caleb turned to face him. He was taller than Crane by 2 inches, and he used neither the height nor anything else, just stood and looked at the man. I'm accomplishing a supply run into the Eastern Canyon, he said, on the chance that there's a way station cache up there that could help this town if the storm is as bad as the data suggests. The data, Crane repeated, with a particular inflection. Her data? Yes. Crane was quiet for a moment. Hamill behind him stared at the floor. I want to make something clear, Crane said, his voice dropping slightly in register, losing the pleasantness. I have operated in this valley for 23 years. I have built things here, the mill, the contracts, the infrastructure that lets this town function. I have done that through relationships and agreements and a particular understanding with the people who live here. When an outsider comes through and starts making noise about catastrophes and emergency routes and, he paused again, and whatever else she's been filling your head with, it creates instability. It makes people nervous when they don't need to be nervous. That kind of panic costs money. It costs trust. The storm doesn't care about trust, Caleb said. If there even is a storm. There is. You can't know that. I've watched that mountain range for 7 years. Caleb looked at Crane steadily. I know what the sky looks like before a serious storm. I knew it this morning from the ridge. Your foreman knows it too from the upper slopes. He looked briefly at Hamill, who still didn't look up. The difference between you and the storm, Harold, is that the storm doesn't have a reason to pretend. Crane's jaw tightened. The pleasantness was gone entirely now. There's work here for a man with your skills. Real work, well paid. I made that offer in good faith. I know you did. It still stands. I know that too. Caleb turned back to the mule. I'm not interested. A long pause. He could feel Crane standing there, recalculating, the way a man who's used to trading in obligations recalculates when the other party simply doesn't want anything he's offering. She's going with you, Crane said. The Ellison woman. It wasn't a question, and Caleb didn't treat it like one. Yes. People are going to talk. People are already talking. He checked the knot on the pack strap. They've been talking since the day I got here. It hasn't changed anything. Another pause. Then Crane said, with a precision that had something threatening underneath it. If you go up into that canyon and come back with some story about a cache that's going to change the situation, if you use that woman's calculations to make me look like I mishandled this, I want you to know that I have a long memory and a lot of patience. Caleb looked at him one more time. So do I, he said. And I've spent 7 years not needing anything from anyone in this valley. That hasn't changed either. Crane left. Hamill went with him, still without having said a word or looked up from the floor. Tobias reappeared from the far end of the livery, pretending he'd been there all along. Ready to go? He said to Caleb. Waiting on one more, Caleb said. She came through the livery door 5 minutes later with her canvas bag and the leather journal and a wool coat that was not quite warm enough for what they were about to do. She looked at his face when she came in and read something in it. Crane was here. Just left. What did he say? The things men say when they're used to having leverage and they've run out of it. He untied the mule. You need a warmer coat. She looked down at hers. This is the warmest one I have. He went to the back of the livery where Tobias kept extra blankets for horses that needed them in cold snaps. He pulled one out, wool, heavy, smelling of horse and dry hay, and held it out to her. Wear this over. She looked at the blanket. That's a horse blanket. It's wool. It'll cut the wind. She took it, looked at it for another moment, and put it on over her coat. It came down past her hips and was wide enough that it wrapped around her considerably. She looked, if he was honest, entirely practical about it. She pulled the canvas bag over one shoulder. "All right," she said. "Let's go." The Eastern Canyon Trail was harder going than Caleb had expected, and he'd expected it to be hard. The trail itself hadn't been properly used in years. He could tell by the way the undergrowth had crept in at the edges, the branches that needed pushing aside, the places where erosion had softened the path and you had to test the ground before trusting it. The cold made everything brittle. The sky above the canyon walls was grey and getting darker, and the wind, which had been a constant presence all morning, had started doing something in the last hour that he didn't like, gusting and then going still. Gusting and then going still, the way wind behaves when a large weather system is reorganizing itself overhead. Mara was tracking the wind direction every 10 minutes, writing in the journal she carried open in one hand while she navigated the trail with the other. She stumbled once on a root under the snow-dusted leaf cover and caught herself on a branch with outbreaking stride, barely pausing, continuing to write. He noticed and didn't say anything, which seemed like the right response. They found the first claim marker after about a mile. An old stake, iron, driven into a rock outcropping at the canyon wall, the paint long since gone, but the stake itself solid and square. Mara had the deed annotation memorized. The record said 2 markers, then a left fork toward the canyon's inner wall, then a steep rise of about 40 feet. "I see the markers." He pointed ahead, where a second stake was just visible through the trees, maybe 200 yards further. "Follow those, then look for the fork." "The wind's changed again," she said, looking at the treetops above them. "Gusting from the northwest now. It was northeast an hour ago." How long before it settles? She did a calculation he couldn't see. If my model is right, it'll go calm for a period before the front actually hits, like the air is holding its breath. She paused. That calm could last anywhere from 1 hour to 4. After that, we don't want to be in a canyon. No. He pushed the pace. She kept up without being asked to. The fork was where the annotation said it would be. A narrow break in the canyon wall where the rock face stepped back at an angle, creating a slot barely wide enough for a loaded mule. The rise was more than 40 feet, closer to 60, steep and rocky with patches of old ice on the north-facing sections that required care. He went first, testing the holds, then turned and helped steady the mule on the worst of the ice. Mara came up without help, using the exposed rock and a length of his rope that he'd fixed to a boulder at the top. She came over the lip, breathing hard, her face flushed from the cold and the effort. She didn't waste breath commenting on it. What was on the other side of the rise was a natural shelf in the canyon wall, maybe 30 feet deep and the same wide, with a rock overhang above it that would have cut most of the snowfall and much of the wind. And at the back of the shelf, built into the rock itself, was a low structure, timber and stone, the timbers dark with age but present, the stone mortared with something that had cracked in places but held. A door, iron hinges, green with oxidation but intact. A wooden bar across the outside latch. Caleb and Mara looked at it. "It's here," she said. Her voice was quiet. "It's here," he agreed. He lifted the bar. It was heavy, swollen slightly with moisture and age, and put his shoulder against the door. It moved, protesting, and then swung inward on a gust of released air that smelled of old wood and something else, something dry. Inside was dim, the only light coming from the door and 2 gaps in the timber roof where the planking had separated. When his eyes adjusted, he could see the shelving, rough timber, floor to ceiling along 3 walls. And on the shelving, stacked and wrapped in oilcloth, were supplies. Not in perfect condition. Not in the condition of things that had been tended recently, but present. He pulled the oilcloth off the nearest shelf stack. Dried beans, sealed in clay pots, the clay cracked on one but intact on the others. Hardtack, desiccated but sealed. Salt pork, in a barrel that had dried and shrunk around the meat but still held it. Lamp oil. 3 large tins. Blankets, wool, tightly rolled, the outer ones dusty and slightly mildewed, but the inner ones, when he unrolled them, still sound. Behind him, Mara had come in and was moving along the other shelves, opening and checking. Her hands were quick and methodical. "Rope," she said, "a lot of it, and tools. Axes, 2 of them, and a saw." She stopped at the far corner. "There's a written inventory here, on the wall." She leaned in, brushing dust off the surface. "From 1849. Someone came back and added to the original stock. She read quietly, running her finger along the text. Whoever they were thorough. He stood in the center of the cache and turned slowly, taking stock of what was there. It was not a fortune. Some of the food had gone to age or moisture or something that had gotten in through the roof gaps. But what remained was real, and it was here, and in a valley about to be cut off from its supply roads. It would mean the difference, not between life and death, because Blackridge would survive the storm regardless, but between hardship and catastrophe. "Can we get this down to the valley?" Mara asked. "Not all of it. Not today." He looked at the roof gaps, at the sky visible through them. "We take what's most critical. What will help the households that are worst off?" He thought through the map of the town in his mind. The boarding houses, the families he knew were low on wood and food from what Walt had told him. Blankets first, then the lamp oil, then whatever food stores are intact. They worked fast. The mule could carry a significant load, and they loaded it without talking, moving back and forth between the shelf and the pack, making decisions quickly. She suggested the rope. They'd need it for a second trip, for getting heavier supplies down the rise. He agreed and added it to the load. She found a tin of waterproof matches, sealed, and held it up. He nodded and she tucked it in her bag. They were finishing the loading when the wind stopped. It went still so suddenly that the absence of sound was almost physical. One moment, the gusting, the cold movement through the canyon, the branches flexing and subsiding. Then nothing. The air was utterly calm and very cold and very heavy. Mara looked at the sky through the roof gaps. Her face was absolutely still. "That's the calm," she said. "How long do we have?" She looked at her journal, at the morning's notations. She calculated. She looked at the sky again. "Maybe 2 hours. Could be less." He closed the cache door and dropped the bar back across the latch. He took the mule's lead and started back toward the rise. "Caleb," she said. He stopped. "When we get back," she said, "Crane's people aren't going to believe us just because we found it." "No," he agreed, "and Walt can't make the council move without something they can see." "He'll come up here himself," Caleb said, "with the right people. When he does, it'll be enough." He looked at her. "You were right about all of it. The storm, the route, the cache, that matters." "It matters to the people who will decide to believe it," she said. "The others. The storm will settle that argument," he said. "It doesn't need our help." She looked at him for a moment in the dead still air of the canyon, the sky above them the color of iron, the trees unmoving. Then she picked up the mule's lead rope from where he'd dropped it and held it out to him. He took it. They went down the rise. Behind them, in the perfect unnatural stillness, the first flake of snow fell, small, light, almost delicate, and melted on the warm stone of the cache doorway. Then another, then several more. The storm had stopped holding its breath. Getting the loaded mule back down the rise took longer than going up. The ice sections were worse with the full weight on the animal, and there was a moment near the top on the worst of the north-facing section when the mule lost purchase on a patch of ice and went sideways and nearly took Caleb with it. He caught the lead, braced with his whole body, dug his boots into a crack in the rock and held. The mule scrambled and found its footing. Mara, below them on the trail, had braced herself against the canyon wall in case she needed to catch anything that came down. Nothing came down. They recovered, took a breath, and kept moving. The snow was picking up by the time they cleared the canyon mouth and hit the main trail back toward Blackridge. Light still, in terms of accumulation, but steady and driven now by a wind that had returned from the northwest with a specific intention. The temperature had dropped another 3 degrees at least. Mara was writing in her journal with her coat collar up and her shoulders forward and the horse blanket over everything, and her handwriting, when he glanced at it, was cramped and hurried but still legible. They came into the north end of Main Street, and the town's reaction was immediate. It was the mule that people noticed first, the loaded mule, the oilcloth-wrapped supplies, the rope, all of it unmistakable as cargo from somewhere specific and purposeful. 3 people stopped on the sidewalk and stared. A boy ran toward the center of town at a speed that meant he was running to tell somebody something. Tobias appeared at the livery doorway, took one look at the load, and came out to help. Walt Pruitt came up the street at a half-run, his hat in his hand. He pulled up in front of them and looked at the mule and then at Caleb and then, briefly, at Mara. "You found it," he said. "Everything the annotation described," Caleb said, "plus a 1849 edition. Full inventories on the cache wall. We need to get a proper wagon up there, today before the road gets bad, to bring the rest of it down." "Today," Walt repeated, and looked at the snow coming down and made the expression of a man doing rapid arithmetic. "Today," Caleb said again firmly. Walt put his hat back on. He stood straighter. "I'll get Delman and his team. He's got the biggest wagon in the valley, and he was already on our side. The blankets in the load, Mara said. The Kettler household, the East Side boarding houses, they need those first. Walt looked at her. The morning's politics were still in his face, but something else was there now, too. Something that hadn't been there before. Yes, ma'am, he said, and he meant it. Behind them, on the sidewalk, people had gathered, a dozen, then more, watching the loaded mule, watching the sheriff standing in the falling snow with his hat back on and his jaw set, and watching the mountain man and the outsider woman who had just come down out of the Eastern Canyon with supplies none of them had known existed. Harold Crane was among them. Caleb saw him at the edge of the group and looked at him directly and said nothing. Crane looked at the mule, at the load, at Mara, standing in the falling snow in a horse blanket, her journal tucked under her arm, her face tired and cold and entirely composed. Something moved through Crane's expression. It was not an easy thing to watch, because it was not simple. It was the complicated look of a man who has built his entire sense of himself around being the person who knows what's coming and has just found out publicly that he didn't. He turned and walked back the way he had come. The snow kept falling. The snow that had started falling gently by mid-afternoon was, by nightfall, something else. Shh, darling. Caleb stood at the window of the boarding house and watched it come down in the lamplight. Not the soft, separate flakes of the afternoon, but a solid moving mass, horizontal as much as vertical, driven by a wind that had settled in from the northwest with the particular commitment of something that had been building for a long time and had finally arrived. The North Road was already invisible. He could see the shape of the building across the street, but not its details. And that building was 60 feet away. Behind him, in the small common room, Mara was at the table with her journal and the lamp pulled close, writing in the tight, rapid hand she used when she was recording observations rather than thinking through problems. She'd changed out of the wet things from the canyon trip. Mrs. Kettler had produced dry clothes from somewhere, practical wool things that fit approximately, and she had a cup of tea going cold next to the journal that she kept meaning to drink and kept forgetting. They'd spent the last 4 hours in motion. Walt's wagon run to the canyon cache had gone. Robert Delman had hitched his 2 big draft horses and gone up the eastern trail with 3 men and the full wagon. Caleb leading them and Mara staying in town to help coordinate where the supplies went. They'd gotten 2 full loads down before the snow made the trail inadvisable. Not everything in the cache, but most of what mattered. The sound blankets, the lamp oil, the food stores that had survived, the tools. Walt had organized a distribution that was imperfect and argued over and accomplished in a confusion of cold and fading light, and people who hadn't fully believed the warning until they were standing in 2 inches of snow with more coming, and suddenly found belief came easier. The Kettler household had blankets. The East Side boarding houses had lamp oil. 4 families with young children had food reserves they hadn't had that morning. It wasn't everything. It was what was possible in the time they'd had. Accumulation rate is faster than the 1847 record, Mara said, without looking up from the journal. She'd been outside twice in the past hour measuring. How much faster? Roughly 30%, she paused. If it maintains this rate, the North Road will be completely impassable by morning, possibly by midnight. She wrote something else. The Eastern Canyon route will hold longer. The terrain channels the wind differently, but I wouldn't want to take a loaded wagon up there after another 6 hours of this. Caleb turned from the window. She was still writing. Her tea was entirely cold. He picked it up, went to the kitchen, where Mrs. Kettler kept the stove going regardless of circumstance, poured it out and refilled it from the pot and brought it back. She looked at the cup, then at him. Thank you. You keep forgetting to drink it. I do that. She wrapped her hands around the cup. You should sleep. Tomorrow is going to be worse than today. So will the day after. Yes. She looked at the window, at the dark and the driven snow beyond it. 3 days, maybe 4 before this breaks, possibly 5. She said it plainly, without drama, which somehow made it worse than drama would have. He sat down across from her at the table. In the lamplight, she looked tired in the way people look when they've been running on focus, and the focus is still there, but the body underneath it is filing a complaint. There was a smudge of ink on her left hand, and her hair had come most of the way out of its pins, and she'd stopped trying to fix it somewhere around the second canyon run. Crane's going to do something tomorrow, he said. She looked at him. I know. Not about the storm, about us, about this. He gestured between them, meaning the day, meaning the cache, meaning the particular shape of the story that the town was now telling itself about what had happened. She was quiet for a moment. He'll want to reclaim the narrative, she said. Either minimize what we did or take credit for it or find something wrong with the way it was done. She paused. He'll go after me specifically. I'm the easier target. We'll deal with it when it comes. She looked at him with those steady dark eyes. You keep saying we. He held her gaze. Yes. She didn't look away, and she didn't look flustered, and she didn't do any of the things women in this town did when Caleb Rourke looked directly at them. She just looked back with the same level of attention she gave to weather data and canyon trails and everything else that required an honest assessment. Then she picked up her tea and drank it. "Get some sleep," she said again. He did. Or he tried.
The storm was worse in the morning. Not dramatically worse. It hadn't suddenly escalated into something cinematic. It had simply continued, which was its own particular kind of relentless. The accumulation on the street was knee-deep in places, thigh-deep, where the wind had built it against walls and fences. The temperature had dropped to the kind of cold that made the inside of your nose hurt when you breathed and turned the moisture in your eyes uncomfortable. The sound of the wind in the eaves of the boarding house was a constant low note that you stopped hearing consciously after a while and started feeling instead, a vibration in the walls and in the back of your jaw. Caleb went out at first light and broke a path from the boarding house to the sheriff's office, which took 40 minutes with a shovel he'd borrowed from Mrs. Kettler's shed. He could see lights in other windows, people up and moving, the town doing the slow early morning accounting of what the storm had taken overnight and what was still standing. Walt was already at his office, looking like he hadn't slept much. "North Road closed," Walt said. "Delman tried it at dawn in his big rig, got 200 yards and had to turn around. The drifts in the low section past the mill are 6 feet in places." Caleb sat down. "Eastern route?" "I sent Foster up to check at first light. He made it to the canyon mouth. The trail's deep, but not impossible, not with the right equipment." Walt poured coffee, set a cup in front of Caleb. "Here's the thing. There's a family, the Marchands. They farm the northeast edge of the valley, about 4 miles out. They sent their boy in yesterday afternoon before the road got bad, asking for help. The father's got a chest sickness, the mother's alone with 3 young children, and the sick man and whatever supplies they had going into this storm." Caleb wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. "How bad is the chest sickness?" "Bad enough that they were worried before the storm, now." Walt spread his hands. "I don't have anyone I can send. Foster's barely able to manage in this weather, and my other deputy is over on the east side dealing with a roof collapse on the Ulmer property." "What do they need?" "Warm bodies mostly. Someone to help manage the sick man, split firewood, keep things running until this breaks." Walt looked at him carefully. "It's 4 miles in this." "I know how far 4 miles is." Walt nodded slowly. "I figured you'd say that." He paused. "Mara Ellison came by 20 minutes ago, before you did. She had the same look on her face you have right now." Caleb set down the coffee. "She wants to go. She said she has some medical knowledge, not a doctor, but her father was, apparently. She knows enough." He thought about the canyon trail, knee-deep and drifted in places. About 4 miles of that with a loaded pack in this wind. About a family with a sick man and 3 children who'd sent their boy into town for help. "Is she at the boarding house?" he asked. "She said she'd wait for you." She was waiting, packed and dressed, when he got back. She'd borrowed better boots from somewhere, sturdier than what she'd had, laced high. And she had a pack that was organized with the same methodical logic she applied to everything. Medical supplies on top from what he could see, food and blankets underneath. Mrs. Kettler was standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the front room, looking at both of them with the expression of a woman who had opinions and was measuring whether the moment warranted sharing them. She'd been skeptical of Mara for weeks, not cruel, not like the women on the street, but skeptical in the way of a boarding housekeeper who evaluated everyone who came through her door on terms of practical usefulness. The past day had shifted something in her assessment. Caleb could see it, even if Mrs. Kettler wasn't ready to say it. "There's food," Mrs. Kettler said finally. "I put it in the pack, the left side pocket." Mara looked at her with brief surprise. "Thank you." Mrs. Kettler made a sound that was not quite acknowledgement and went back to her kitchen. They went out into the storm. To hunt. 4 miles in that weather was an education in stubbornness. The first mile was manageable. The town's main street offered some protection from the wind where the buildings stood close on both sides, and the snow had been broken by the morning's foot traffic, even if it was filling back in steadily. Past the edge of town, on the northeast road, the situation changed. The wind came across the open sections without obstruction, and the drifts had built in the hollows and low places until the road itself was invisible and you navigated by knowing where it ought to be. Caleb went first, breaking trail. He was aware at intervals of exactly how much energy that cost. Your body spending itself against the resistance of snow that came to your thigh in the worst spots, the wind constantly trying to get underneath your coat, the cold working steadily on the exposed skin of your face.
He set a pace that was sustainable rather than fast, and he checked behind him at regular intervals. Mara was there, every time he looked. Head down against the wind, following in the track he'd broken, her pack on her back, moving with the same stubborn steadiness she'd shown on the canyon trail. She wasn't thriving in it. She was cold, and it showed. Her face was red and tight-looking, and she'd pulled her scarf up over her mouth. But she was there, and she kept being there, which was what mattered. At the 2-mile mark, there was a windbreak of old pine along a ridgeline, and they stopped in the shelter of it for 5 minutes. She pulled the scarf down and breathed deliberately, slowing her breath from the effort. She pulled her journal. She'd brought it, of course, and made a note about the wind direction. He didn't say anything about that. It was who she was. "How's your feet?" he asked. "Cold." "Fine." She put the journal away. "Yours? Cold. Fine." She looked at him with something that was almost humor, or the cold, exhausted edge of it. "We're a pair," she said. "We are," he agreed. They kept going. The Marchand farm was a low house and 2 outbuildings set back from the road behind a stand of bare cottonwood. Smoke was coming from the chimney, thin but present, and there was a lamp in the window. Someone was watching. A small face appeared and disappeared from the glass as they came up the path. The door opened before they reached it. A woman stood there, early 30s, dark circles under her eyes, a baby on her hip, and a girl of maybe 6 years pressed against her side. The look on her face when she saw 2 people coming through the snow was not relief exactly. It was the face of someone who'd been holding something very tightly and was just now allowing themselves to check how much it weighed. "Walt Pruitt sent us," Caleb said. She stepped back and let them in. Her name was Nora Marchand, and she'd been awake for most of 2 days. Her husband, a lean man named Ike, was on the bed in the back room with a fever that had been climbing since the night before last. His breathing labored in the specific way that meant the sickness had settled into his chest. The firewood inside the house would last another day, maybe a little more. The woodpile outside was accessible, but splitting and hauling in this weather required more strength than she had while managing a sick man and 3 children. Mara went to the back room without being asked. Caleb heard her talking to Ike in a low, steady voice, asking questions, listening to answers, the measured exchange of someone who knew what they were looking for. He went back outside and found the woodpile under a canvas tarp that had accumulated 2 feet of snow on top. He cleared it, split what needed splitting, and carried it inside in loads until the stack by the fireplace was enough for 3 days. He was on his 4th trip when the older child, the girl whose name was Petra, 6 years old and observing him with the frank assessment children use before they have learned to disguise it, appeared in the doorway between the main room and the entry. "Are you the mountain man?" she asked. "I suppose so. Mama said you came back to town. She said you were famous. Your mother's being generous." Petra considered this. "The lady is fixing Papa," she said. "She made him drink something, and he said it tasted bad, but she said too, bad." "That sounds about right. Are you her husband?" Caleb carried the next load of wood past her to the fireplace. "No." "Oh." Petra followed him. "She's pretty," she said, in the tone of a 6-year-old sharing an observation she's decided is relevant. Caleb set the wood down. He thought about a reasonable response to that from a man who'd known Mara Ellison for about a week in a blizzard. "She's capable," he said. "That's better than pretty." Petra thought about this with the seriousness it probably deserved. "Can it be both?" "Yes," he said. "It can." He went back out for the last load, but they stayed at the Marchand farm through the rest of that day and into the night, which had not been the original plan but became necessary when Ike's fever spiked in the afternoon, to a point where Mara wasn't comfortable leaving. She'd found what she needed in her pack, a preparation her father had taught her for chest fever, willow bark, and a few other things she'd had the foresight to bring. And she managed the fever through the afternoon with the patient attention of someone who understood that managing it was all you could do, and that was enough. By evening, it had come down to a level she described as still concerning but stable. Caleb kept the fire, fed the children, and at one point read aloud from the only book in the Marchand house, a battered almanac from 4 years ago, because the 2 older children needed something to do, and it was what was available. Petra fell asleep against his arm somewhere during a section on soil composition, and he sat with her there for 20 minutes, until he could shift her without waking her. Nora Marchand watched him do it from across the room, with an expression he couldn't fully read. Later, after the children were in bed, and Ike was sleeping, and the storm was still working at the walls of the house with its single-minded northern persistence, Nora sat at her kitchen table with a cup of something hot and said to Mara, who was updating her records, "The town's been unkind to you." Mara didn't look up immediately. Some of it, she said. Most of it, Nora corrected. I heard. I go into Blackridge for supplies every 2 weeks. I hear things. She wrapped her hands around her cup. I'm sorry, I don't know what I should have done. Exactly, but something. Said something, at least. Mara looked at her now. You had a sick husband and 3 children and a farm to run. That's a reason, Nora said. It might not be a good enough one. The 2 women sat with that for a moment, honestly, the way women sometimes do when they're past the point of politeness. Caleb, on the other side of the room, said nothing. He was mending a split on his boot with a needle and thread from Nora's sewing kit, and he kept his eyes on the work. But he was listening. Your data was right, Nora said to Mara. About the storm. Yes. People didn't believe you. Some did, Mara said. She glanced toward Caleb, a brief look before returning to her journal. Eventually. Nora looked at Caleb too. Then she said, more quietly, he's not what people think he is. No, Mara agreed. He's not. Caleb set down the boot. The trip back to Blackridge the next morning was not easier than the trip out, but it was different. The storm had eased slightly in the night, not broken, just paused in the way storms sometimes do before their second effort, and the trail they'd broken coming was still partially visible under the new accumulation. They made better time going back. They came into town to find it had not been idle. Walt Pruitt had used the storm's first full day to do what he'd said he'd do. He'd gone to the council, not to Crane first, as Caleb had suggested, and the supplies from the cache, physical and present and undeniable, had accomplished what no amount of argument had. Gerhard Ulm had come off the fence. Robert Delman had organized a firewood distribution from his own stockpile to 3 households that were critically low. 2 of Crane's own mill workers, acting without Crane's specific direction, had used the mill's draft horses to clear the main street and the paths to the most critical buildings. The town was, imperfectly and argumentatively, and with the specific friction of people who hadn't wanted to listen, now being forced to act, taking care of itself. Harold Crane had not disappeared. He was not the kind of man who disappeared. He'd spent the first full day of the storm in a series of private meetings, with the council members, with his foreman, with the banker. And Caleb heard the shape of it from Walt without needing the details. Crane was repositioning. He was building a version of events in which his initial caution had been prudent, in which the cache discovery had simply confirmed what good management would have identified anyway, in which the outsider woman's role was, not denied, but minimized. Adjusted to fit a story that left Harold Crane's standing intact. It was the move of a man who understood that the facts were no longer arguable and so was focusing on their interpretation. Caleb had expected it. What he hadn't expected was Dorothea Crane. She came to the boarding house on the afternoon of the second storm day, when Caleb and Mara had been back from the Marchand farm for a few hours and were both in the particular exhausted state of people who have been cold and working for a long time and have not yet managed to sleep properly. She knocked and Mrs. Kettler let her in with a look that suggested this was interesting, and Mrs. Kettler intended to remember every detail. Dorothea looked different than she had before, not in her clothes. She was still dressed carefully, the quality of her coat and boots still spoke of Harold Crane's money, but in her face, the calculation was different. Less surface, more underneath. She sat across from Mara at the table and didn't waste time. My father is telling people that the supply situation was already being managed, she said. That the cache was known to his surveyors and was going to be incorporated into the winter plan. Was it? Caleb said, from where he stood at the window. No, she said it flat. His surveyors never went past the first claim marker in the Eastern Canyon. I checked. Mara looked at her carefully. Why are you telling us this? Dorothea put her hands flat on the table. They were good hands, steady. Because he's wrong, she said. And because I have spent a long time not saying that out loud, and I'm tired of the weight of it. She looked at Mara directly. What you did, the weather records, the cache, the Marchand family, that's going to get buried if someone doesn't say clearly what actually happened. Who found the records? Who read them? Who pushed for the trip up the canyon when nobody else was willing? You'd say that, Mara said, against your father. Dorothea's jaw tightened. I'd say the truth, she said. That's not the same as being against anyone. Mara looked at her for a long moment. Caleb watched both of them. The storm pressed against the window behind him, still working, still committed, indifferent as ever to the complicated things people were doing inside the buildings it surrounded. All right, Mara said finally. Dorothea nodded once. Something in her shoulders settled, not relaxed, settled, like something that had been held at an angle and was now level. There's going to be a full council meeting when the storm breaks, she said. Walt's already called it. My father will have his version ready. I want yours ready too. The journal's a full record, Mara said. Every observation, every date, every reading. It's all there. Can I borrow it? Dorothea asked. Just to read. I want to understand exactly what you tracked and when. Mara hesitated, and the journal was clearly something she didn't hand over easily. Then she slid it across the table. Dorothea took it, looked at the cover, opened it to the first page and began to read. Outside, the second effort of the storm had begun. The wind came back against the walls of the boarding house, harder than before, and the snow drove sideways past the window, and somewhere down the street a shutter had come loose and was banging in an irregular rhythm against the side of whatever building it belonged to. Nobody in the room mentioned it. They were all too busy with other things. The storm broke on the fifth day. It didn't end gracefully. It wound down the way hard things usually do, gradually, unevenly, with a few last bursts of wind that rattled the windows and threw snow against the glass before finally, sometime in the early hours of the fifth morning, going quiet. Caleb woke to the silence but before he woke to the light, because after 7 years in the mountains he'd learned that the absence of sound was often more significant than sound itself. He lay still for a moment, listening to the nothing, and then he got up. The sky outside his window was the particular pale grey-blue of very early morning after heavy weather, washed clean, the clouds broken and moving fast in the high altitudes, the low country below them still. The snow lay deep and undisturbed on every surface, 3 feet in the open areas, considerably more against walls and in the hollows. The North Road was invisible. The Eastern Canyon Trail, he knew, would be hard going but passable. The town of Blackridge Pass sat inside its white stillness like something that had been held under water and just released. He dressed, went downstairs, and found Mara already at the table with her journal. She looked up when he came in. "It's done," she said. "Yes." She looked at the window. Something in her face was different than it had been 5 days ago. Not softer exactly, more settled, like something she'd been braced against was no longer pushing. "Final accumulation," she said, looking at her notations. "Somewhere between 68 and 72 inches in the valley. The record from the 1847 storm was 61. She paused. "We'll need to verify when someone can properly measure." "You were right," he said, "about all of it." She looked at him steadily. "I know," she said. And she said it without apology and without pride, just as a fact that had been demonstrated and didn't need either. He poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove and sat across from her. Outside he could hear the first sounds of the town waking, a door somewhere, boots on steps, the distant sound of a shovel striking packed snow. "The council meeting is today," she said. "Yes." "You think Crane's going to come in with his version?" "He already has his version, has had it for 3 days. Caleb wrapped his hands around the mug. "The question is whether the room is willing to hear it." She was quiet for a moment. "Dorothea read the whole journal," she said. "Twice, I think. She returned it yesterday evening. She'd made notes on a separate paper. Dates, specific readings, the timeline of when I brought the data to different people and what each of those people said." She paused. "She's more thorough than I expected." "She has her father's ability to build a case," Caleb said. "She's just decided to use it differently." Mara considered that. "Is that enough? Against 23 years of what he's built here?" It was the honest question, the one without a comfortable answer. "I don't know," he said. "But the storm's done the main part of the argument for us. Everyone in this valley spent 5 days living inside proof." The council meeting was held at noon in the community hall, and most of Blackridge came. Not just the council, not just the property owners and the respectable families and the people with standing. Walt Pruitt had made the meeting open, which was not strictly standard procedure and which Harold Crane had objected to in a note delivered to Walt's office that morning. Walt had read the note and set it on his desk and not replied, which was itself a kind of reply. The hall was full. Standing along the walls, packed in the rows of chairs, people who'd spent 5 days managing a serious storm and had come out the other side with a specific need to understand what had happened and who had been telling the truth about it. Caleb stood near the back. Mara was beside him, her journal under her arm, her face composed. Walt opened it simply. He laid out the timeline, the warning, who gave it, when, what data it was based on, the council meeting where Crane had recommended against action, the cache discovery, the distribution of supplies, the Marchand family. He did not editorialize. He just put the facts in order and let them stand, which was the most honest and most devastating thing he could have done. Harold Crane sat in the front row and his face was controlled and attentive throughout, the face of a man who had prepared for this room and was not going to let it see him work. When Walt finished, Crane stood. He was still, even now, an impressive figure. The physical authority of him, the ease with which he occupied space that most men had to negotiate. He thanked Walt for the summary. He agreed that the storm had been serious and that the outcome had been, on balance, good. He acknowledged that Miss Ellison's weather observations had been useful. He said the word the way you put something down that you don't want to be holding. Then he made his pivot. He talked about the cache being on land adjacent to his Eastern Timber concession. He talked about the need for organized management of emergency resources rather than improvised expeditions. He talked about the importance of clear authority structures in crisis situations. Every sentence was a brick in a wall he was building with his back against it, and every brick was technically true, and the wall was designed to leave him standing on the inside of it. He was good at it. He had decades of practice. Dex Hamill was it all. Hamill was in the room. He sat in the middle section, his hat on his knee, not looking at his employer. Caleb had noticed him when he came in. When Crane finished, Walt asked if anyone else had something to say. Dorothea Crane stood up. The room went very still in the specific way rooms go still when the thing happening is the thing nobody expected. Harold Crane turned to look at his daughter. His expression didn't change, but something around his eyes did. Dorothea had her notes. She spoke clearly and without hurry. She laid out the exact timeline of when Mara's warnings had been brought to different people in the town and what each of those people had said in response. She cited specific dates. She quoted, from memory, what Crane's foreman had said at the first community meeting, that the crews had been reporting unusual cold from the upper slopes for 2 days. And she noted that this had been consistent with Mara's data and inconsistent with her father's stated position at the same meeting. She said all of this looking at the room rather than at her father in the way of someone who has decided what they're doing and is doing it. She sat down.
The room stayed quiet for a moment longer. Then Dex Hamill stood up. He turned his hat in his hands and looked at the floor and then up at the room. He was a stocky, plain-faced man who was not comfortable speaking in public and made no attempt to pretend otherwise. The crews did report it, he said, the unusual cold, for 2 days before the storm. He paused. I told him, Mr. Crane. He said it was normal early season cold and not to change the work schedule. Another pause. It wasn't normal. I knew it and I didn't say so publicly. He looked at Mara. The first time he'd looked at her directly in this room. You were right, and I should have backed you when you first came to the meeting. He sat down. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Not uncomfortable exactly, more like the silence after something that had been stuck finally moves. Harold Crane said nothing. He did not look at Hamill. He looked at the wall above the front of the room with the expression of a man who is revising his understanding of several things at once and is too disciplined to let it show completely. Walt looked at the council. I'd like to put forward a motion, he said, to formally record that the emergency response to the storm was initiated by Miss Mara Ellison based on documented weather observations, and that the supply route through the Eastern Canyon was discovered and utilized based on land record research conducted by Miss Ellison over 3 months of study. The record should reflect that. Gerhard Olm said, seconded. The vote was 4-1. Harold Crane voted no, which everyone present marked and would not forget.
After the meeting, outside on the snow-packed steps, the town rearranged itself. It did not do so dramatically. There was no single moment of reckoning, no clean turning point where everything was settled. That was not how towns worked, and Blackridge was not an exception. What happened was the small incremental thing of people adjusting their positioning. Physically, in who they stood near on the steps, who they spoke to first when they came out of the hall. Several people made their way to Mara. Not the prominent ones, not the council members or the major property owners. The ordinary ones, Nora Marchand's neighbor, who said she'd heard what Mara had done at the farm. One of the boarding house women from the east side, who said the lamp oil had made a real difference on the second night. 2 men from the timber crews, Hamill's men, who said nothing exactly but nodded at Mara with the specific acknowledgement of people who want to mark something without making a speech about it. Mara received all of this with a kind of careful steadiness, the same way she received most things. She was not overcome by it. She was not cool about it either. She was just present with it, which was perhaps the most honest response. Caleb stood to one side and watched Harold Crane move down the steps with 2 council members who'd voted with him. Crane glanced back once at the small cluster of people around Mara, and then at Caleb. The look between them lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Crane turned away first. Dorothea appeared at Caleb's elbow. She was pulling her coat closed against the cold, her breath making small clouds. He's going to regroup, she said. He'll find another angle. Probably. He's not finished. No. Caleb looked at her. Neither are you. She met his eyes, and something passed between them that was not quite what it might have been a week ago. Not the calculation of before, not the adjusted version she'd shown at Hester's that first morning. Something more straightforward than either. "No," she agreed, "I'm not." She looked at Mara. "She should stay," Dorothea said quietly, "if she wants to. This valley needs someone who reads it honestly." "Tell her that yourself," Caleb said. Dorothea looked at him for a moment. Then she walked toward Mara, and Caleb heard her say, in a voice that was direct without being either warm or cold, "I'd like to talk to you about what comes next, if you're willing." That evening, Caleb walked to the north end of town and stood where the road disappeared into the drifted white of the valley's edge and looked at the mountains. They were visible again now that the storm had broken, the Sentinel Peaks and the ranges beyond them, the high country he'd spent 7 years learning in a silence and solitude that had been, for a long time, exactly what he needed. He could see the line of the snowpack on the upper slopes, heavier than last year's by his estimation. The cold was sharp and clean after the closed, worked-over warmth of people and rooms and 5 days of storm management, and he breathed it in and let it settle. He heard her coming before he saw her. The particular rhythm of her footsteps, unhurried. She came and stood beside him and looked at the mountains without saying anything, because she understood that sometimes things didn't need words. He said it anyway. "I was planning to go back." "I know." A pause. "Were?" He looked at her. She was looking at the peaks, her face turned into the last light of the afternoon that was coming off the snow in that particular winter gold. The wind moved a loose strand of her hair across her cheek and she didn't fix it. "You have your data here," he said. 3 months of it. "And another winter at least, before I've got enough to publish anything worth publishing." She paused. "Maybe 2. That's a long time to stay somewhere that's been unkind to you." She thought about that honestly. "It was," she said. "Some of it still will be. Harold Crane's not going anywhere. Half the town will go back to not seeing me properly within a month." She turned to look at him. "But some things changed. And the valley it's real data, real terrain. I can't get what I need from anywhere else." "No," he said, "you can't." They stood in the cold and looked at the mountains together. The light was changing, the gold going amber, the shadows on the high snowfields going purple and then blue. "The high country north of the Sentinel Range," he said. "There's a phenomenon up there, a weather reversal that happens in deep winter when the temperature inversion traps cold air in the lower valleys and the upper slopes are actually warmer. I've never seen it documented anywhere." She turned to look at him fully. "How often does it happen?" "Most winters." "Not everyone. 3 out of the last 7 for sure." She was very still. If that's real, that would contradict the standard model for this mountain range entirely." "It's real." She looked at him, then back at the mountains. Then at him again. Her dark eyes were doing the thing they did when she was calculating, rapid and focused and missing nothing. "You'd need to be up there to measure it properly," she said, "in the winter. Which would mean a winter camp." "Yes." She was quiet. He could see her working through it. The logistics, the data collection requirements, the cold, the isolation, and something else underneath all of that which she wasn't saying yet. "I've never camped in the high country in winter," she said. "Not seriously." "I know. I'd be a liability for the first part of it." "Probably." She looked at him. "You don't seem bothered by that." "Everyone's a liability at things they haven't done yet," he said. "That changes." She was quiet for another moment. The last of the gold was leaving the sky, and the cold was deepening in the way it does when the day's warmth gives up entirely and the night takes over. They were both breathing visible clouds into the air between them. "This isn't just about the data," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," he said. She looked at him with those careful, honest eyes. She wasn't flushed or nervous or performing anything. She was just looking at him the way she looked at everything, directly, taking it seriously, deciding what was real. "I'm not easy to be around," she said. "I know that. I get absorbed in things. I forget to eat. I make notes at inconvenient times. I don't—" She stopped. "I'm not what anyone expected, ever. Including myself sometimes." "I don't need you to be what anyone expected," he said. She was very still for a moment. Then, "What do you need?" He thought about it honestly, because she deserved an honest answer, and not a smooth one. "Someone who looks at things straight," he said, "who says what they mean, who doesn't need me to be something I'm not." He paused. "The mountains don't care what you look like or what people think of you. They only care what you do. I've been comfortable with that for a long time. I've been less comfortable with most everything else." She looked at him. "And me?"
You're the first person I've met in a long time who operates that way on flat ground too. The wind moved through the gap between them, and she held her coat closed against it, and neither of them moved. "All right?" she said. Quiet, but definite, the way she said most things that mattered. "All right," he said. They left Blackridge Pass on a Thursday morning, 3 days after the storm broke. Not immediately, not in a dramatic departure. There were things to do first. Mara spent 2 days organizing her records, making clean copies of the most critical data sets, meeting twice with Dorothea to discuss the Eastern Canyon route and how it ought to be formally registered with the land office as an emergency alternate. She found a room in a more comfortable boarding house for when she came back because she intended to come back. The valley's data didn't stop being useful because she was going to be gone for a season. Caleb spent the same 2 days with Walt Pruitt, going over the cache inventory and making recommendations about how to maintain it as a permanent resource. He went out to the Marchand farm once more to check on Ike, who was recovering steadily. Nora pressed a jar of preserved plums on him when he left, the kind of gift that means more than it costs, and he took it with the same directness that he tried to bring to everything. The morning they left, Main Street was not empty. It should have been. It was early, barely past first light, the kind of hour when most of the town was still indoors and the cold was still the official authority over everything. But word had moved, the way it always moved in Blackridge, and when they came down the street with Caleb's mule loaded for a serious expedition, and Mara beside him with her pack and her journal and the better boots, there were people on the sidewalks. Not a crowd, not a send-off, just people. Nora Marchand's neighbour. The 2 timber workers who'd nodded at Mara after the meeting, Tobias from the livery, who raised a hand. Mrs.
Kettler in her doorway, in her heavy shawl, who watched them pass with the expression of a woman who had revised her opinion of something and wasn't going to make a fuss about it, but wanted it noted. Foster, the young deputy standing outside the sheriff's office, who said, "Come back before spring's out." "Before spring's out," Caleb said. Walt was there. He fell into step with them for half a block, his hands in his coat pockets, and said to Mara, "That weather documentation, the full record, if you're willing, the land office wants a formal copy, for the town's permanent records." "I'll send one from the Northern Post," she said, "when we pass through." Walt nodded. He stopped at the end of the block, the edge of where the town properly ended and the road began. He looked at the 2 of them for a moment. "You could have stayed," he said to Caleb. Not pushing, just noting. "I know," Caleb said. Walt looked at Mara. "Both of you." "We'll be back," Mara said. "This is where the data is." Walt smiled, a tired, genuine thing. He touched the brim of his hat. They kept walking. Dorothea was not on the street. Caleb had not expected her to be. She was not someone who did public gestures easily, and what had happened between them, and what happened between her and Mara in those 2 days of meetings, was its own thing, separate from a send-off on a cold morning. But when they passed the end of the Crane property on the north edge of town, he saw her in an upstairs window. She was watching. She didn't wave. He nodded once. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she turned back to whatever she'd been doing, and they kept going. The north road was clear enough to walk by then. The town's men had put 2 days of work into it, and the packed surface was manageable, even if the drifts on either side were still chest-high in places. The sky was that particular clear blue that follows serious weather, a blue with depth to it, the kind that made the Sentinel peaks look close enough to touch. The cold was real and steady and clean. They walked in silence for the first mile, which was comfortable. She was making notations, of course, and he was reading the trail and the weather and the particular way the snow lay on the high slopes to the north that told him what kind of conditions they'd find up there. They'd talk plenty later, at camp, and over the weeks ahead. There was no pressure to fill the first mile with words. At the point where the north road curved and Blackridge Pass disappeared behind the first tree-covered ridge, she stopped walking. He stopped beside her. She looked back at the curve in the road, at the last visible trace of the town they'd just left, the smoke from chimneys rising straight in the still air, the sound of a hammer somewhere, faint, someone repairing storm damage. She looked at it with no particular nostalgia, just attention. "It's a strange place," she said. "I spent 3 months being invisible there and then 5 days being whatever I was." "Real," he said. She looked at him. "What? You were visible before. They just weren't looking." He paused. "That's different from not existing." She was quiet for a moment, turning that over. "It felt the same," she said. "I know." He thought about 7 years of solitude that had been a choice and also sometimes hadn't been, about the particular loneliness of being somewhere and not being seen, about the way the mountains had been easier, partly because they made no pretense of seeing you at all. It doesn't feel the same forever. If you stop letting their looking be the thing that decides whether you're there. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the mountains ahead of them, the high white slopes, the dark line of tree line, the sentinel peaks against that impossible blue sky. How long did it take you, she asked, to stop letting it decide? He thought about that honestly. I'm still working on it, he said, just in different conditions. She made a small sound that was genuinely a laugh. Not performed, not social, the real thing. It was the first time he'd heard it, and it was a better sound than he'd expected, low and brief and surprised out of her. She turned back to the road north and started walking. He fell into step beside her. There are things that towns remember and things they forget, and the line between them is not always drawn the way you'd expect. Blackridge Pass remembered the storm of that year for a long time. The depth of it, the days of white silence, the north road that closed, and the eastern canyon that didn't. They remembered the cache, and eventually they maintained it properly, which was an improvement. They formally registered the eastern route as an emergency alternate, which was another. The record in the land office, with Mara Ellison's name on it as the primary data source, was a dry and institutional thing, but it was there. And it did not change. Harold Crane did not recover his former standing completely. He remained powerful. He was too established for one storm to finish him, but something had shifted in the room when Dorothea stood up and Hamill stood up, and rooms remember shifts even when the people in them pretend not to. He sold his Eastern Timber concession the following spring, which was practical rather than symbolic, and he never again tried to claim credit for something he hadn't done in a public meeting, which was perhaps the most significant change. Dorothea was something the town had to revise its expectations about, slowly and not always graciously. She had her father's intelligence and her mother's stubbornness, and she'd found, in those 5 days of storm and meeting and reading Mara's journal, twice cover to cover, a direction that suited her better than the one she'd been pointed in. It took years. Most things that matter take years. Walt Pruitt served 2 more terms as sheriff and retired to a small farm at the valley's southern edge. He kept a copy of Mara's weather data on the wall of his office until the day he left it. Nora Marchand's husband Ike recovered fully. He sent a note to the Northern Post addressed to Caleb and Mara that spring, thanking them in the particular clumsy, earnest way of men who don't write letters much. Petra, his oldest daughter, grew up to be a surveyor, one of the first women licensed to do so in that territory, which may or may not have had anything to do with the mountain man who read almanacs aloud while she fell asleep on his arm during a blizzard. And Caleb and Mara came back, as promised, before spring was out. They came back in May, when the snow was retreating from the lower slopes, and the valley was running with meltwater, and the air had that particular freshness that only exists in mountain country when winter finally releases its grip. They had data, months of it, meticulously recorded, the winter reversal phenomenon documented across 3 elevation bands in the high country north of the Sentinels. Data that would eventually challenge and revise the standard meteorological model for that range. Mara spent 2 weeks at the land office organizing it and met twice with the men from the nearest university town who'd heard through channels that there was something worth seeing. Caleb spent those 2 weeks mostly outdoors, reacquainting himself with the valley in a way that was different from his first return, less defended, less set against staying. He helped Tobias repair the livery roof. He spent a day with Walt going over the Eastern Canyon Trail and identifying where it needed work before next winter. He was not comfortable with the town, and the town was not entirely comfortable with him, but there was a workable arrangement in it now, a mutual understanding of what was being offered and what wasn't. One afternoon, near the end of those 2 weeks, he went back to the ridge north of town where he'd looked at the mountains on the night he'd arrived. He stood there for a while, looking at the same view, and thought about the man who'd stood there the first time. 7 years of deliberate solitude wearing him, the particular careful distance he'd built between himself and everything that required more than survival. Survival was not nothing. He'd never believed it was. It was the foundation that everything else had to be built on. And most people in towns didn't know that because they'd never had to learn it, and not knowing it made them soft in ways that cost them when things got hard. He didn't regret the 7 years. They'd made him what he was, and what he was had been useful when the storm came. But survival was not everything. And he'd known that too, if he was honest. Known it and mostly looked away from it. It turned out that the right person was simply someone who approached you the same way you approached terrain. Honestly, without prettying it up, without wanting you to be something simpler than you were.
Someone who did the work and expected you to do yours and didn't confuse being needed with being loved, and who understood that sometimes the most profound thing two people could do was look at the same difficult truth and say, I see it too. He'd spent a long time looking at mountains. He'd needed to. But mountains don't look back. He went back down the ridge and found Mara at the land office, surrounded by papers, arguing pleasantly but firmly with one of the university men about the methodology of her elevation measurements.
She looked up when he came in and there was something in her face. Just a shift, barely visible, the slight easing of something. That was for him specifically. Done, she said. Done, he said. She turned back to the university man. As I was saying, Caleb pulled up a chair and sat down and listened to her take the argument apart brick by brick and thought, yes, this is the thing.